When someone strikes at you, verbally, emotionally, or socially, they usually believe they are seizing control. They imagine that the moment they wound you, you will crumble, beg for approval, or bend to their will. But this is a dangerous misconception. The act of hurting another is often mistaken for authority, yet true power is never gained by inflicting pain, it is only mimicked. The illusion of power is seductive because it masks weakness beneath a veneer of dominance. Those who attack rarely see that their action is a confession of fear, inadequacy, and insecurity. To hurt someone else is to reveal that you cannot master your own internal world. At first, it appears that the aggressor has the upper hand. They speak harshly, manipulate narratives, or exploit vulnerabilities, and the immediate result may seem like control. Yet control obtained through coercion is fragile. It requires constant maintenance, constant vigilance, and constant validation. One word, one act of detachment from the target, and the fragile scaffolding of their power begins to crumble. The more they seek to dominate externally, the more dependent they become on external reactions to validate their own sense of self. Their apparent strength is a reflection of internal instability. There is also a subtle psychological cost they rarely acknowledge. Every act of cruelty or attack etches a small fracture in their character. They may temporarily feel justified or victorious, but each act of aggression leaves a residue of guilt, fear of exposure, or subconscious anxiety. Unlike you, who must endure and process the hurt, they carry a hidden burden that cannot be released. Hurting someone becomes an internal transaction. Their confidence is borrowed and fragile, always contingent on your response. If you refuse to react in the ways they expect, their borrowed power collapses. Furthermore, those who inflict pain often underestimate the very nature of perception. The world rarely judges actions in isolation. Patterns are observed, histories are remembered, and reputations are built or destroyed accordingly. By hurting others, they reveal their patterns to those who are paying attention. Anyone with perceptive awareness sees the fragility beneath their aggression. They mistake momentary impact for lasting authority, failing to realize that true respect and influence come from internal mastery, not external submission. Power achieved through fear or harm is transactional, not transformational. It is also critical to understand the role of self-delusion in those who hurt others. They often believe that control over another grants them self-worth, that domination equals significance. But significance grounded in another's pain is fleeting and superficial. The moment the target stops reacting, the illusion shatters. Their actions, which they thought were decisive, become meaningless. The illusion of power is so convincing that it can motivate repeated attacks, creating a cycle of dependency on your responses. Each strike is a desperate attempt to prove strength, yet with each attempt, the internal fissures widen. They are prisoners of their own need to dominate, blind to the irony that by trying to control you, they relinquish control over themselves. This illusion also blinds them to the long-term consequences. In attempting to assert dominance, they ignore the cumulative effect of alienating allies, creating enemies, and sowing distrust. They rarely anticipate that the very actions they use to prove superiority will, in fact, isolate them. Every strike is a double-edged sword. They may feel empowered in the short term, but the structural integrity of their social, emotional, and moral life is compromised. Hurting others is seductive because it promises immediate satisfaction, but it fails to account for the unseen erosion of respect, trust, and inner peace. The act of hurting another is a mirror reflecting the vulnerabilities and insecurities of the aggressor. What they perceive as strength is often a projection of fear. The more they attack, the more they attempt to hide their inadequacy, yet that the very act exposes it. There is a paradox at the heart of all aggression. To dominate externally is to reveal weakness internally. The illusion of power is not a mystery, it is a trap. Those who believe they are strong because they can wound others are, in reality, walking a tightrope over their own instability. Moreover, the target's response, or lack thereof, determines the real outcome. The person who maintains composure, who understands the psychology at play, and who refuses to grant the aggressor the satisfaction of reaction, transforms the apparent attack into a reflection of the aggressor's fragility. While the aggressor believes they are asserting control, they are steadily losing it. Every attempt to dominate someone who remains unmoved exposes the illusion more clearly, eroding confidence and magnifying the gap between perceived power and actual resilience. The irony is brutal yet simple. Hurting others is not a path to empowerment. It is a shortcut to self-exposure. Each aggressive act is a declaration of dependence on external validation, a reliance on the target's reactions to feel significant. Those who see beyond the surface understand that the real power lies not in the act of inflicting pain, but in the mastery of self, in the ability to remain unshaken while the aggressor entangles themselves in a web of their own making. When someone hurts you deliberately, they rarely consider the cost that begins accumulating inside them the moment they act. They focus on the visible result, your reaction, your silence, your discomfort. What they do not see is the invisible ledger they have opened within their own psyche. Every intentional wound creates a debt, and unlike material debt, this one cannot be repaid easily, forgiven cleanly, or escaped through denial. It follows them quietly, shaping their behavior long after the moment of harm has passed. Psychological debt forms because the human mind demands internal consistency. When a person violates their own deeper sense of order by causing harm, the psyche responds with tension. This tension must be resolved somehow. Some attempt to resolve it by justifying their behavior, telling themselves stories that paint them as right, necessary, or superior. Others bury it under distraction, aggression, or self-importance. But justification does not erase debt, it only compounds it. The mind remembers what the ego tries to forget. Over time, this debt begins to influence how they perceive you and the world around them. They may grow defensive in your presence, suspicious of your intentions, or irrationally hostile without understanding why. This is not strength, it is anxiety. The unresolved debt makes them hyper, aware of the possibility that their actions will be exposed, judged, or mirrored back at them. They start to fear consequences they cannot name. The person they hurt becomes a psychological reference point, a reminder of a fracture they cannot fully repair. This debt also distorts memory. The aggressor often exaggerates your flaws and minimizes their own actions, not because it is accurate, but because their psyche demands relief. To maintain a sense of self-respect, they must rewrite the narrative. In doing so, they become trapped in a version of reality that requires constant reinforcement. Each time they retell the story, they sink deeper into it. What began as a single act of harm evolves into a self-sustaining psychological structure that limits growth, self-reflection, and genuine connection. Another consequence of this debt is the erosion of trust, both outward and inward. When someone knows they are capable of intentional harm, even if they deny it consciously, they lose faith in their own integrity. This creates an undercurrent of insecurity. If they could betray someone else, they assume others can betray them. Relationships become transactional, guarded, and shallow. They may appear confident, but beneath the surface is a constant vigilance born from unresolved guilt and fear. The most insidious aspect of psychological debt is that it demands payment. The psyche seeks balance, and when imbalance persists, it manifests through anxiety, irritability, projection, or compulsive behavior. The aggressor may lash out at others, sabotage opportunities, or unconsciously recreate situations where they are punished or rejected. This is not fate, it is internal accounting. The debt must be acknowledged or paid in another currency. Ignoring it only increases the interest. What makes this debt particularly cruel is that the person who caused the harm rarely associates their suffering with the original act. They believe their distress comes from external pressures, bad luck, or the flaws of others. The connection remains hidden, yet the cost continues to accumulate. Meanwhile, the person who was hurt has the opportunity, through awareness and integration, to process the pain and move forward. The aggressor remains stuck, bound to an unresolved past they refuse to confront. This dynamic explains why those who harm others often appear restless, dissatisfied, or perpetually conflicted. They chase control, validation, or admiration, hoping to compensate for the internal deficit. But no amount of external success can erase an internal imbalance. The debt persists because it was never acknowledged. Power, status, or applause cannot substitute for self-honesty. The psyche demands reckoning, not distraction. There is a bitter irony here. While the aggressor believes they have moved on, the unresolved debt ensures they never truly do. The person they hurt becomes a silent presence in their inner world, not as a memory of strength, but as a reminder of weakness. Each attempt to dominate or dismiss others is another effort to avoid confronting the original fracture. The more they avoid it, the more it shapes their behavior from the shadows. True resolution would require facing the harm without distortion, accepting responsibility without self-deception, and integrating the experience honestly. But most never do. They continue carrying the debt, paying it through anxiety, broken relationships, and a diminished capacity for genuine peace. Unaware that the cost was incurred the moment they chose to hurt someone instead of confronting themselves, power is often mistaken for action, for confrontation, for the ability to strike first or strike hard. Many believe that responding immediately, defending themselves, or retaliating is the only way to reclaim control when someone has harmed them. Yet the most profound form of power lies not in reaction, but in withdrawal. To remove oneself from the cycle of provocation is to shift the entire dynamic, silently redefining who holds authority without a single word or gesture of retaliation. Withdrawal is not surrender, it is strategic presence. When you stop feeding the aggressor with the responses they crave, anger, fear, guilt, or defensiveness, you break the implicit contract that grants their behavior meaning. Every insult, slight, or act of harm depends on acknowledgement. By refusing to provide that acknowledgement, by refusing to act in the ways they anticipate, you deny them the very feedback loop that sustains their sense of dominance. The power they believed they held collapses quietly, invisibly, as the world no longer validates their attempt to control you. Withdrawal also shifts perception, both internally and externally. Internally, the aggressor experiences disorientation. Humans are hardwired to seek patterns, to understand cause and effect. When their actions no longer produce the expected reactions, they face cognitive friction. The aggressive act becomes an echo in a vacuum, and the aggressor struggles to locate themselves in a reality that has changed without any outward confrontation. Externally, observers, whether colleagues, friends, or onlookers, begin to notice the change. Authority in its truest form is recognized by restraint and composure, not by the volume of one's attack. Withdrawal allows others to see the aggressor's instability while elevating the silent strength of the one who steps back. The psychological mechanics are subtle but ruthless. Every interaction carries an unspoken negotiation for control. When you engage, even defensively, you confirm the aggressor's agenda. Each reaction becomes a small victory in their eyes, reinforcing the illusion that they can direct your emotional or behavioral state. Withdrawal, however, interrupts this pattern. It creates an absence that is paradoxically potent. The aggressor is left with only their own projections, their own assumptions, and their own untested limits. Without your participation, their sense of control is unanchored, leaving them exposed to the consequences of their own choices. There is also a long-term compounding effect. When repeated withdrawal occurs in response to repeated attempts to harm or provoke, a pattern emerges that the aggressor cannot ignore. The expectation of immediate, reactive engagement erodes. The aggressor may escalate, attempt alternative tactics, or even become frustrated and confused, yet every new strategy is met with the same unyielding absence of participation. Over time, this consistent boundary establishes a form of authority that is invisible yet unassailable. True influence in human dynamics is not earned through aggression, but through demonstrating that external forces cannot manipulate or destabilize you. Withdrawal communicates mastery. Withdrawal also reframes the narrative in your favor. By disengaging, you refuse to be a character in the aggressor's story. They may believe they are shaping the events, controlling the outcome, or provoking the reaction they desire. But when you step back, the story loses its power over you. You become an observer of your own life rather than a participant dictated by others' impulses. This perspective is disorienting for the aggressor because humans often measure success by their ability to elicit predictable responses. When predictability is removed, the aggressor's sense of efficacy is undermined. The tactic is deceptively simple yet psychologically profound. It requires discipline, patience, and the courage to resist immediate gratification. The instinct to respond, to defend, or to retaliate is deeply ingrained. Yet it is precisely this instinct that aggressors exploit. When you withdraw, you reject the bait entirely. You transform potential weakness into latent strength, chaos into control, and reactivity into strategic silence. Withdrawal also communicates boundaries with clarity that words often fail to convey. Instead of engaging in argument, debate, or conflict, absence itself becomes the declaration you will not be moved by arbitrary aggression. This silent enforcement of limits is harder to challenge because it does not rely on aggression or provocation. It is an assertive void, a statement of autonomy that cannot be undermined by conventional confrontation. Over time, withdrawal reshapes the power dynamics not just between you and the aggressor, but across the social landscape surrounding both parties. Others witness the shift and adjust their own behavior accordingly. Authority, respect, and influence are increasingly recognized in those who demonstrate consistency, control, and independence from manipulation. The aggressor, meanwhile, faces mounting frustration as their habitual leverage fails to produce results, leaving them exposed to internal doubt, external observation, and a growing realization that their perceived dominance was never real. When someone intentionally hurts you, it is easy to focus on the external impact, the insult, the betrayal, the manipulation. But the truth, often invisible to both parties, is that the real casualty is usually their own ego. Every act of aggression, every attempt to dominate or wound, originates from a fractured sense of self. The person who attacks is attempting, consciously or unconsciously, to assert superiority over another, to mask their own internal instability. What appears as strength is a desperate performance designed to soothe the fragile architecture of their identity. The ego that strikes is always reactive. It is constructed on comparison, judgment, and the need for external validation. By hurting others, they seek a mirror reflecting their own importance, dominance, or worth. They imagine that by diminishing someone else, they elevate themselves. Yet this elevation is illusory. True power is grounded internally, not externally. Their ego, dependent on manipulating the environment to feel significant, becomes enslaved to the very behaviors they believe assert control. The irony is that in seeking to dominate others, they are reinforcing their own dependence on external validation. The aggressor rarely realizes that every act of harm widens the gap between who they are and who they believe themselves to be. The ego's dependence on superiority is fragile because it is fundamentally reactive. The moment the target refuses to respond in predictable ways, the ego falters. What once felt like authority now feels uncertainty. What once felt like control now feels exposure. Their perception of power is entirely contingent on your participation. By withdrawing or maintaining composure, you reveal the fragility that they have tried to conceal, forcing their ego to confront its own inadequacy in ways that they cannot control. This vulnerability is compounded by projection. Aggressors often externalize their internal conflict, blaming you for provoking them, for misinterpreting intentions, or for challenging them unfairly. Yet the conflict they project outward is always rooted in the internal debt of their own unresolved needs, insecurities, and fears. By attacking, they attempt to rewrite the narrative, to impose meaning where their ego feels insufficient. But no amount of external manipulation can reconcile an ego that is fundamentally dependent on affirmation from others. Moreover, the ego's injury is cumulative. Each act of harm, each attempt to provoke, leaves residue. It generates subtle anxiety, insecurity, and cognitive dissonance. They may rationalize their behavior, amplify perceived injustices, or reframe events to protect self-image, yet the underlying wound remains unaddressed. This hidden debt manifests in compulsive behaviors, overreactions, or obsessive attempts to regain dominance. Unlike the person they target, who can integrate the experience and transform it into resilience, the aggressor remains bound to a cycle that continually reinforces their vulnerability. The paradox is stark. The aggressor believes they are powerful, but the ego that drives their actions is, in reality, a victim. It is a prisoner of its own narrative, constantly seeking evidence of superiority, while simultaneously aware often unconsciously, of its deficiencies. Every strike is an attempt to heal a wound that they cannot reach through manipulation alone. Every insult is a gesture meant to soothe, yet it compounds the original fracture, leaving them dependent on repetition and escalation. Ego-driven harm also blinds the aggressor to the effectiveness of withdrawal. When the person they target refuses to react, the aggressor's sense of significance collapses. The absence of engagement is a mirror that exposes the truth. Their ego was never strong. It was reactive, fragile, and entirely dependent on external confirmation. The realization is disorienting because humans rarely encounter situations where their attempts to assert dominance are met with neutrality. The more they attempt to reclaim control, the more their inner instability is revealed, creating a feedback loop of self-consciousness and insecurity. This dynamic explains why those who hurt others often escalate, overcompensate, or oscillate between aggression and appeasement. The ego, wounded by its own inability to dominate meaningfully, seeks temporary relief through external expression. They confuse this temporary relief with true power, and aware that their actions only reinforce the very vulnerabilities they attempt to hide. Their self-worth becomes tethered to reaction, and the stronger the withdrawal, the more the ego struggles to reconcile its fractured state. In essence, the person who seeks to harm another is often engaged in a battle with themselves, projecting their fear, inadequacy, and need for validation onto the target. What they perceive as victory is, in fact, an exposure of weakness. The ego that they believe is asserting control is simultaneously unraveling, ensnared by its dependence on the responses it hopes to elicit. While the target moves forward with awareness, composure, and autonomy, the aggressor remains tethered to the fragile scaffolding of their own making, trapped in a cycle where every attempt to assert superiority only deepens the hidden wound within. When someone harms you intentionally, the instinctive response is to fight back, retaliate, or reclaim what you perceive as stolen. Society reinforces this instinct, celebrating visible triumphs and measurable victories. Yet the most profound form of victory is never external. It is internal. It is the quiet mastery of your own mind, the unwavering composure in the face of provocation, and the cultivation of strength that cannot be measured by the reactions of others. External victories are fleeting. Internal victory is permanent. True victory begins with awareness. It requires understanding the dynamics at play, recognizing the intentions behind the harm, and discerning what can and cannot be controlled. When you internalize this awareness, the need to react diminishes. The moment becomes a mirror. The aggressor acts, but the outcome is no longer dictated by their behavior. You maintain autonomy over your emotional state, and that autonomy is power in its purest form. While the aggressor believes they are shaping events, it is you who decides the meaning, the impact, and the course of your own response. Internal victory also neutralizes leverage. The person who seeks to dominate you thrives on the expectation of a reaction. They measure their success by your compliance, your anger, your embarrassment, or your distress. When you refuse to provide these markers, when you control your inner state, their apparent power diminishes. They become the one trapped by circumstance, reacting to a reality that no longer conforms to their expectations. Withdrawal, composure, and strategic non-engagement are not signs of weakness. They are demonstrations of a strength that cannot be challenged externally. Another key component of internal victory is resilience. Those who harm you are often motivated by their own insecurities, envy, or desire for control. Their attacks are ephemeral, contingent on circumstances, and ultimately unfulfilling. By focusing on internal mastery, you transform the experience from a wound into a lesson, a source of insight, and an opportunity to strengthen your own sense of agency. Each act of harm becomes an exercise in self, discipline, emotional intelligence, and psychological fortitude. While the aggressor remains entangled in the immediate effects of their actions, you extract long-term gain by cultivating skills that cannot be taken from you. Internal victory also reframes the concept of success. External victories are conditional, dependent on outcomes beyond your control, recognition, revenge, restitution, or public validation. Internal victory, by contrast, exists independent of circumstance. It is rooted in clarity, self-awareness, and alignment with one's values. By maintaining focus on internal measures, calmness, integrity, adaptability, you achieve a state where external circumstances, including aggression from others, become irrelevant to your sense of self-worth. The aggressor's attempts to manipulate, intimidate, or provoke lose significance because they no longer dictate your internal state. This form of victory is cumulative. Every time you resist the urge to react, every time you observe without engaging, every time you choose self-mastery over retaliation, you build a psychological advantage that cannot be eroded by others' actions. The aggressor expends energy attempting to create chaos in your life, while you conserve energy, reinforce boundaries, and cultivate resilience. Over time, the asymmetry grows, your internal strength increases as their external attempts to dominate lose effect, exposing the fragility they sought to hide. Internal victory also transforms the relationship with the aggressor. While they may believe they hold power, their influence diminishes as you cultivate equanimity, clarity, and autonomy. They become irrelevant in the landscape of your mind because their actions no longer dictate your emotional or behavioral responses. By detaching the locus of control from their behavior and relocating it entirely within yourself, you shift the dynamic from reactive to proactive, from vulnerable to invulnerable. Moreover, internal victory is liberating. It frees you from cycles of resentment, obsession, or retaliation that the aggressor may hope to provoke. While they may believe they have inflicted damage, the real cost is on them, their ego, their illusions of control, and the psychological debt they carry. You, on the other hand, move forward with composure, focus, and the clarity to invest energy where it produces actual growth. Success becomes a reflection of self-mastery rather than external validation. Finally, internal victory requires discipline and consistency. It is not a single act or a momentary choice. It is a sustained commitment to sovereignty over your mind, emotions, and responses. The more you practice internal victory, the less vulnerable you become to manipulation, provocation, or harm. External victories may fade, reputations may change, and circumstances may shift, but the internal state, once fully mastered, remains intact, unassailable, and enduring